while hitting a lot of the same notes as classics like Final Fantasy Tactics when it comes to gameplay and battles, and showing obvious influence of the Ogre system with tarot cards and class emblems, the question stands if Crimson Tactics can stand on its own, or if its quirks and some of the early access scuff will end up holding it back. Now, this is a first look rather than a full review just for that reason. It's still early access, and only about half of the game is in there. That, combined with only getting the press key from the agency a couple of days before the game dropped, means a rather condensed experience before writing this, and that does end up working against the game since it means the quirks are more likely to become frustrations, and the bugs become far more apparent when pressed into 2 10-hour days. Starting out, even before you've started playing, the game does something I actually appreciate though, and that is giving you proper difficulty and gameplay settings. And while I prefer more granular adjustments like we see in the Pathfinder games by Owlcat, these are still better than what most games give us. Basically, we choose two things: the density of battles and the difficulty of enemies. For density, tactics mode is less units and strategy mode is more. This also impacts your party's size limit, and weirdly, in spite of it being labeled as being more for new players and streamlined, I find tactics mode a bit harder since you end up with a less flexible team due to much smaller parties. Though it does result in slightly faster battles since there's simply less pieces on the board. I do wish the descriptions of these modes actually indicated it adjusted battle size though. In regards to the actual difficulty, you have an automatic mode that adjusts based on how well you play, as well as a manual settings mode from story up to about nightmare difficulty. And while I didn't have time to deep dive on all of them, it seems the biggest difference is AI behavior, unless I just had terrible luck, since enemy evasion, stats, etc. didn't feel much different on easy versus nightmare on the bit I tried in each mode, though it could get more distinct later on and I wouldn't have seen it. The reason I make this note is because the start of the game is, well, a bit long before you even get control of your protagonist, much less before you start getting to make recruitment and equipment decisions. The prelude portion is 3 battles long with a historical character, and then you have a couple battles with your character as a knight in training. Only after that do you get into the normal flexibility you'd expect from a tactics title. While skipping the story, this starting bit took about an hour to complete. Without skipping the story, it took a bit closer to 2 hours. So if I wanted to reach the end of early access, I had to not dive into that too much. Now, I did consume the story itself once. It's still a work in progress. You have the usual kingdom thrown into strife, and you're some small figure in it, and it's doing the setup for you to be the hero that came out of nowhere. You already have an obvious traitor, the rebellion, heck, you even have a character that is looking like it will become Delita too. All of this being the standard trope, but it's fine. That said, there's a weird, annoying kind of dichotomy about how it is told. There's a cutscene with nicely written dialogue, it's voice acted very well, and it flows naturally. But the actual in-game dialogue is weirdly butchered attempts at Old English-esque type language, and sadly one of the most broken ones I can recall in recent history. Bad enough that despite being used to it, thanks to that being a trend for easily about 40 years now in games, it took me several reads to process some of it. This is mostly because it kept changing up the grammar rules, and I use the term rules loosely. Even within the same character's dialogue, much less from scene to scene, it would change. So there's points where I did end up fogging out through it, and while it would be a big undertaking, I would probably recommend a second pass through the dialogue of the game up to this point, and make it simple English or go over it with a set of grammar rules in place. One thing that redeems this weird dialogue choice, though, is the character animations. This is one they took a proper lesson from the classics on, and they used the character models to show the story rather than just telling it, which is something a lot of modern tactical RPGs fail at. I appreciate that attention to detail since it is so much more effective than the standard talking heads a lot of modern games in the genre use, and it compensates pretty well for the sketchy dialogue. I think the only nitpick I would have for the actual progression in the game outside of dialogue would be when it decides to give you the branching option for going after the dragon questline or the undead questline, which both become available on the world map at the same time. I personally would probably either unlock the undead cleanup skill, which is exorcism, earlier, or not have these questlines available at the same time. Since by levels, it very obviously wants you to do them in a specific order, since you're level 12 or 13 at the point it happens, and you don't unlock exorcism until 15. Basically, be careful about making things available that are going to be roadblocks or frustrations if it's not necessary, especially since you can do both of them. Now, speaking of skill availability, tactics games live or die on their gameplay, and this one does the actual combat good enough, with only one gripe and one observation, while the non-combat stuff needs a bit more time in the oven, but not for the reasons you'd think. The combat side of things is your standard fare, grid-based combat. Attacks from the front are less effective than attacks from the back, and each turn you get one movement and one action, though you can spend that action to go a bit further. Pretty much what you'd expect. Similar situation where physical fighters are more prone to magic damage, and magic users are more prone to physical damage, due to equipment limitations. It is a bit more simplified than games like Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics in that there's not a proper elemental rock, paper, scissors system. At least, not yet. Though it would be a nice addition, especially since most characters have an elemental affinity, except for one that doesn't, because you can actually hire people that are non-affinity, and it basically determines their magic pool. The only elemental ties so far have to deal with undead, where darkness heals them while healing magic harms them. Though they do actually borrow the mana system from these kind of older games, so that will be familiar, even if it diminishes the value of mana recovery items. Now, the notes I have for the combat that may impact your enjoyment basically comes down to two things. One, the enemies beeline towards you, for better or worse. This basically makes the ideal strategy, at least for me, camping and setting up kill zones for the enemies as they trickle in. The higher difficulties just result in enemies using more abilities on the way to you and against you, so it doesn't change it a lot unless you're going for specific achievements. I think the game would benefit from trigger zones like its predecessors. The other thing is that when you have a kill target goal, and this is not always true, but it is true if they want the characters to stay for later points in the story, you have to wait for that character to escape the map to get the game to progress. They'll just sit there and not take any damage from further attacks. And this is kind of irritating, especially if it's a close fight, since the enemies will keep attacking you until they get off the field. To counterbalance this a bit, they do actually have enemies retreat if their morale breaks, which does speed up clear all enemies maps. And also, it's part of the recruitment system since you can persuade people to join you as an enemy morale goes down, though this system can be fiddly since any character that talks cannot be recruited, and the chances can get a bit odd against certain enemies because I've had it as low as like 15 to 30%. Now, outside of combat, things can get a little bit fiddly, and is actually where I ran into a few bugs. Probably the biggest issue I have is a keywords issue. When shopping for spells, for example, you can get a lot of skills that have status effects, but you have to back out through multiple menus to get to the in-game manual to read what those are, then work your way back into the shop, when there's actually plenty of room for status effect descriptions on screen, or even mouse over effects, because currently it is just mouse and keyboard, with plans for controller in the future. Something else that all the open space could be used for is showing who has what equipped, how many are equipped, etc. with spells and items, but it doesn't do that either. So generally I found myself having to spend an inordinate amount of time menuing in shops, in the crafting hub, and even on the character screen to manage everything. And as more stuff comes into play, I don't see this getting any better. And if money was a bit easier to come by, then I could be less picky about this and just buy a whole lot of stuff. And you can sort of curb this by saving money until you start to struggle against enemies, but that does hinder advancement a bit. And no, grinding for extra money or levels is not really viable as of yet, at least in my opinion, since I have almost 20 hours in the game and have literally only had one random encounter. Simply put, my main gripe with most of the out-of-combat stuff is a mix of menuing and a lack of displayed information. This is true throughout. I like the grimoire system for spells though, I like the actual skill system proper since it's a nice mix of functionalities, and I like the map travel, though I do wish towns were a bit more clearly indicated on the maps since it's hard to tell the buildings apart when they're all just circles with dots. Now, you noticed I mentioned the skill system in there. This is because it takes a slightly different approach, while still being inspired by its predecessors. Basically, once you unlock a skill on a class, you can use that skill regardless of the class you shift to, as long as you have the equipment needed for the skill, of course, such as a bow for bow skills or a melee weapon for melee skills. I think the only thing I would add to the wishlist for this would be a capstone skill to expand equipment options when switching off of the class, since as it stands, I'm fairly limited by gear for making more eccentric builds. For example, if I want to make a hybrid healer and mage, it's pretty easy. They have overlapping equipment, stats, etc., so it works quite well. But if I want to make a hybrid knight and healer to make a sort of paladin, it will fall flat since I can't equip the gear I need to make others viable, such as a staff on the knight base to give it magic damage boost, or a sword on the priest base to give the melee damage boost. Sure, this can be answered with new classes, which there are still plans for, but it's always more satisfying if it's done by the player rather than by a class pick. Now, speaking of class changes, as of the release of this video, there is a bug with the class changes, so make sure you unequip all of your gear before changing, since I had to eat a character's gear when I changed them off of their class to a new one, which is unfortunately an expensive bow specifically. This should be an easy fix and is probably in the pipeline, but it is definitely something that can hurt you a lot that you should keep an eye out for. This is not helped by the fact that the autosave system is weirdly cruel, autosaving after an event rather than before it. So if you enter a battle, the autosave will be in battle rather than before it. And it seems like any time I made a major change, the autosave was after the change rather than before it, which ended up with me just pushing through with really suboptimal setups rather than being able to fix things. Now, there is one mechanic I haven't touched on yet, and that is mounts. You get introduced to them in the beginning of the game. They can speed you up and even give you a massive hit point buffer on the character riding them, since you have to take out the mount first before you can take out the rider. But on the downside, they take one of your character slots when equipped, basically making that one unit on a horse take 2 slots, so they better be able to carry the weight. And sure, if the mount has special abilities, that can help make it more viable, like Dragon Breath and such. But the horses, I'd generally rather have another character, especially since mounted units take up a 2x2 square rather than 1, which really inhibits their movement anyways. So spending more on a horse in a shop rather than another character just really does not seem worth it to me. Now, I know this video has been up and down, where I like one aspect like the classes, combat, etc., but still find some issues to pick at. But that's the point of early access, to get feedback on problems and fix them, as well as to raise money for the continued production of the game. This second part is also why I try to make it really clear where the game is at now, rather than focusing on promises of where it will be, since early access is not a guarantee of the game getting completed. It's just a guarantee of the game being where it is at now. And most of us learned this through history, but it is still an important warning. So, do you enjoy tactics games? Do you think new ones or old ones are better? Mention it down below, and if you want a more gritty and finished tactics game, check out War Tales on screen now. And as always, if you found this interesting or helpful, hit that like button and comment about some other games you'd like to see down below.